Hero's journey is really powerful. It's really moving. It speaks to our DNA.
It's better to show by examples.
I'd gotten this $45,000 car, which would be $250,000 today, and the bank wanted to take it away. Man, you can feel that. You know, Repo Man is coming.
And it's really interesting, like the psychology of like when you see people do that in real life.
If you describe it as a category, as an abstraction, that's going to reach me here. But if you talk about the symptoms, which is the direct experience, you can feel that.
What is a persuasion story?
The kind of stories we tell every day.
You'd mentioned something about the adventure of it.
You need to develop your ear to listen to how people talk. Let's do past, present, and future.
It does work. Hey, David, thanks for coming onto Social Dream Machine. Before we get into the episode, I just wanted to introduce your book, The Story Code, and kind of read a little bit from the back here since you have a pretty impressive background. David Garfinkel is a successful coach and consultant featured in the Wall Street Journal, Entrepreneur Magazine, Forbes, Fast Company, and the Los Angeles Times. He's worked in dozens of industries, helping clients increase sales and profits with the strategic use of stories and other marketing messages. David was an award-winning journalist in his former San Francisco bureau chief of McGraw-Hill News Service in San Francisco. He's also the best-selling author of Breakthrough Copywriting. First of all, this is a great book. I really love it. There's some amazing parts of it that I didn't really understand myself, but one of the main themes of the book is this concept of the hero's journey kind of being like one of the only concepts of like what people go for actual storytelling. So could you just walk us through what this hero's journey means and kind of how we see it? I think in the book you explain this whole thing with like Rocky, and like that's like a great story, but it doesn't necessarily make you want to buy things. So explain the hero's journey if you can.
Yeah. So Joseph Campbell was a professor at Columbia University in 1948 or 49. He published a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And his whole idea was that there is a similar form or template for stories around the world, stories that really stand out, that last, that stick to our memories. And it's, if you're writing a novel, if you're making a movie, if you're giving an important speech, the hero's journey is really powerful. It's really moving. Somehow I think it speaks to our DNA. I think there's something incredibly powerful about it. It's both entertaining and it is a teaching vehicle. And you don't like learn algebra or history through it, although you might learn a little history. You learn life lessons. You learn practical and yet maybe moral, even metaphysical stuff. And it's not good for persuasion 99% of the time. And I'll explain why in a minute, but let me just explain what it is. And let me say, I'm a big fan of the hero's journey when it's used for the right thing. What I'm a big opponent of is people assuming A, it's the only kind of story there is, and B, that it's the kind of story that works best in persuasion, whether that's sales or coaching someone or advertising copy or anything that has to do with persuasion besides those things. So you start the hero's journey, an ordinary person on an ordinary day in their life. It's an inciting incident. Something unusual happens that pushes this person almost sometimes against their will, usually against their conscious will, onto a path. Onto a series of events, and it puts them in a special world. I don't teach this stuff normally, so I can't pull out millions of examples. You know, I mean, just with Rocky, you know, he was in a meatpacking plant, and now all of a sudden his special world is training to fight the heavyweight champion of the world. Right. And there's a deep psychological aspect of it, and it goes on the premise that who we think we are and who we want to be and what we want at a conscious level is very different from what our true inner nature, our soul, our life purpose wants us to be. And the hero's journey runs us through a series of events of escalating jeopardy and danger to the point where all of our conscious defenses against trying to protect who we think we are fall away at a point where the screenwriters call all is lost, where it seems like there's just no hope and maybe we're going to die. We find this inner strength. It wells up in us. We do something that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the story, and we win. And we're a hero, and we're transformed because now we know who we really are as opposed to who we thought we are. And the hero generally tends to share the blessings of this new wisdom with the community. So that's the hero's journey.
And a point you make, which I thought was fascinating in the book, is you were saying that like in that movie Rocky, it makes you want to like feel like you could create, like, not ever have to worry about writer's block again, but maybe like a direct response ad from that like Mac thing that was selling a course where this guy was getting beat up on the beach and he like couldn't protect his girlfriend, and then all of a sudden he took this course and then he could. So it was just really interesting, like that difference between like almost like direct response writing and the key that you make between like persuasion stories. So I guess, and you're from, what is a persuasion story? I guess it's more like a micro narrative, if you will.
A persuasion story is a version of the kind of stories we tell every day, not when we're writing screenplays or giving speeches, but when we're talking to our friends, our customers, our loved ones, a telemarketer on the phone we want to get rid of, our children, our parents, our brothers, our sisters. There are normal stories we tell, which I don't think had been cataloged. And there are ways of tuning or directing those stories to help us in our persuasion efforts. If you're making a movie, your movie is going to be about 90 minutes long, and it's probably going to be a hero's journey story unless you're doing an experimental film.
Mm-hmm.
If a studio picks it up and releases it to theaters, how are they going to sell it? How are they going to try to persuade people to go see it? Are they going to have a 90-minute hero's journey or a 30-minute hero's journey or a 10-minute hero's journey? Or are they going to have a 30-second or a 60-second trailer?
The trailer.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
Is that trailer a hero's journey? I can answer that one real quickly. It's not. It is a persuasion story. It is a little slice of life, series of moments, they call them in Hollywood, that create desire and curiosity and incentive to go see the whole movie. So even the people who are devotees of the hero's journey story don't use hero's journeys for selling, because Hollywood is such a big industry and there are so many. There's a sub-industry of teaching thousands of people to become one of the 500 writers that actually makes any money in Hollywood in a given year. They're doing a lot of work writing books and giving seminars about the hero's journey. And so, because that's the only kind of story that has been widely explained and branded, if you will, as story, there are a lot of misguided people, some of whom couldn't sell a stick of gum behind a counter in a convenience store, who are out there proclaiming that this is the kind of story you should tell. I mean, there's one Hollywood guru that says all other selling and persuasion is dishonest. Meanwhile, he's taking in millions of dollars a year to telling people they can write screenplays and only 500 of them are going to get any money. Who's dishonest, Robert? Okay. But the point is that the persuasion stories we tell are invisible. Okay. I understand how hard it is to be a content creator. I've been doing it for years, and it really took me a while to dial in the right way to do it. And I'm surprised my nose isn't completely flat the number of times I fell on my face. What did I just do?
You empathize with me. Like, you kind of just, you put yourself in my shoes, I guess. So it made me feel like you knew me.
You know what else I did? I just told you a story.
And you told me a story too, quickly.
Was it a hero's journey story? Did I tell you about all the pencils I snapped in half, about all the headache medications, about how I had to go into years of therapy, how I had writer's block that lasted for 6 months? And yet people don't recognize that as stories. They say, oh, well, you're just pacing or mirroring or you're No, that's a story. Something happened. I started out doing this. It didn't work out. I know what you're feeling. And you probably feel like, yeah, I have some credibility because he's talking about the same things I went through. That's one of the 25 kinds of stories I talk about. People tell, now some people don't have empathy and they can't do that, but a lot of people do. And they tell those stories all the time. And when I was telling you that story, did it make you want to push away from me, or did it make you want to get a little closer and listen to what I was saying?
No, it made me want to get closer, like almost like you understood me more. It reminds me of that. You give the example of like someone at a ticket counter at an airplane booth, I think in the beginning of the book. And like everyone is just attacking this lady and going like, I'm late. It's like the holiday. I want to go home. And I guess the guy is just like, hey, like, I know how you feel. Like, I have a shop that I own and people act crazy during this time. And it's really interesting, like the psychology of like when you see people do that in real life, it does work. There's one thing also that stuck out to me that I was just thinking of when you were describing some of these things too. You'd mentioned like talk about the symptom of a problem. Like you were saying, like there's one time where like this guy was saying something to the effect of like, he bought a Rolls Royce for $45,000 cash, but then like at one point a bank was like coming after him, like trying to like recall it from him or whatever. So these symptom things, that was an interesting way of doing things. Because as a writer, I'm starting to learn it's better to show by examples too. I'm not trying to sidetrack us there, but I thought that was pretty brilliant too.
No, thank you.
Learning that.
That's a really good point. I'm glad to talk about it because writers, we kind of live up here and most people live. No, I'm pointing at my stomach,
Right.
not at my crotch. But although that's another story for another day.
Sure.
But it depends on where you want to reach your reader or your listener.
Mhm.
So if you describe it as a category, as an abstraction, I was having financial problems and it was making my life unstable. That's going to reach me here.
Mhm.
But if you talk about the symptoms, which is the direct experience that you had, and you describe the symptoms in a way that it will evoke an emotion of recognition, I'd gotten this $45,000 car, which would be $250,000 today because he wrote it like long before lots of inflation many years ago. And the bank wanted to take it away. Man, you can feel that. Repo man is coming. That's a symptom of the situation, of the financial struggles he was suffering and the consequences of it. And of course, this is something you would do also in a hero's journey or any other kind of good story writing. So a lot of what we do in the persuasion story follows the common rules that you would find in any kind of storytelling.
And then how did you come up with, so I know that you mentioned 25 and some of them, like there was like origin stories in there, like a founder story. There was also like credibility stories, case studies to build trust. How did you organize like all these things in your head? I'm assuming it took a long time to figure out like that framework.
It did. Yeah, it did. Because, well, let's see. I started out with, okay, let's do past, present, and future. Okay. So that was where I began. And the past were origin stories. The present were stories about how your customer's feeling, different types of empathy stories. And the future were promises. And then I figured out, okay, what are the different kinds of those? But I still had 3 more chapters to come. And a lot of it came from my background as a direct response copywriter and my current work as a coach to copywriters and business owners. I just started looking at the stories we use. And I guess one of the things that might set me apart from a lot of other people in the story field is I don't start with the assumption that there is story is good, let's look at how to tell it well. I start with the question, what is the purpose of the story? What is its function? What is its effect? Now, that might be too analytical or left brain for the pure artists, but people who need to persuade others to buy their goods and services, including artists,
Sure.
need to get results from the marketing that they do. So, yeah, I mean, I have a very well-developed analytical side. I've been analyzing stuff for a long time. These days you'll find lots of copywriting templates for sales letters and headlines and things like that. I came out with the original ones 20 years ago. I do all these things because I realized I was frustrated that there wasn't a reliable system. And then I realized other people are too. They're kind of shooting in the dark all the time. And so I wanted to bring some light to that particular problem.
Someone creates like a VSL, like me and my partner are making like a podcast community for like kind of newer podcasters that are kind of scared, because I had a lot of anxiety and imposter syndrome starting out. We wrote the VSL for it and then we recorded it, and it's like maybe like 20 minutes worth of footage. And there was definitely a lot of different little persuasion stories in there and like anecdotes from our personal life and his film career and things like that. But like when you do like a sales letter or like a landing page, is there usually some sort of like framework they're using for that? Or are you just pulling a bunch of different like persuasion stories in there? Because it seems like a lot of them are like, they'll have a really great headline and then it might have social proof right under the thing, like under, it just seems like there's a lot of patterns like that too. Like it's one big persuasion, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, all copy has, in the way I look at copy, it all has a duty to persuade someone to take some action, whether it's to give their email address or whether it's to buy something, whether it's to set an appointment. I mean, you're in the process of persuading someone, you have to figure out what are you going to what is their problem, first of all. Secondly, what's your solution? What's different about it? And why should they take action now? What's the benefit? And what are they going to lose if they don't? And so there's no set formula for where you can use a story, but certainly, I mean, even social proof, if it's in the form of a testimonial, is a story in my definition.
Mhm.
I don't call them testimonials. I call them testimonial stories.
Mhm.
You can start that way. You can start with a problem solution story, which is one of the 25 that I talk about in the book. Probably the least, along with origin stories, the least original name of a story, because people know about those things already and use them. There's this one guy, and I have to be careful because I don't want to reveal too much, but he's in the marketing business, a particular niche, particular function. And what he heard from a lot of his customers is that when people hired his competitors, the competitors would ask the clients to do the hardest part of their job rather than do it themselves. And this really pissed him off. And so he ran an ad where the first paragraph was about, when you hire someone to do X, Y, Z, don't you find it annoying that they expect you to do X and Y and they only do Z? That's what we think. And he got a lot of responses. And the first thing people would want to talk about was that story. Now, you might say, well, it's a question. It is a question. It's a story in the form of a question. When you do this, does this happen? That's a story. It's not a hero's journey story. It's not 90 minutes long. You might not be able to use it to write a novel, but for somebody in that situation who needs that kind of help and that kind of service, having someone tell the truth about that industry and recognize it and say, we're going to do something different was enough to generate a phone call.
There was an interesting one you had too in the book about like the guy that created the frisbee that flies pretty far, and then they pivoted to a coffee press company. But it was interesting because they kind of went more. It sounded like in the owner's inventions, like it was a coffee company, and you'd mentioned in the book that like they could have gone a bunch of different ways on the way they described, I guess, the founder. And could you break that down, like what your thoughts are on that, your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So the company is Arobi AeroPress, and they make something called the AeroPress. I'm not sure what they call it exactly, but it's an AeroPress coffee machine. It's not electronic. It's totally physical and very clever. Coffee I'm drinking right now is made with it. I feel like I'm their biggest unpaid affiliate, And the guy who invented it had originally developed the Arobi Frisbee or something. It was a Frisbee that looks like a flattened donut. And it was very clever. He's an engineer. He's an inventor. He came up with this. And one day he said, I don't like this coffee in our coffee machine at the office. And so he started working on this Arobi AeroPress. I think that's what it's called. The Arobi is the original name of the Frisbee, and AeroPress is the name of the coffee maker. And in the origin story that I got to use with permission from their website, they talked more about him and his history, and people around the world have their own communities for his coffee maker and so forth, and they didn't talk much about the technical challenges and struggles and the number of times they tried prototypes that didn't work, and the aerodynamic, because there are apparently the same kind of engineering principles that go into designing a jet plane also go into designing this piece of plastic and rubber, with no engine in it. He didn't talk about that at all. And I said, that's appropriate. And it's also a temptation when you spend all this time developing this technology and going through this brutal, frustrating R&D process that you might want to talk about it. But maybe your customers don't want to hear about it. Maybe they want to hear about how you are, and it's fascinating that you developed this toy, and then you developed a coffee maker and people around the world love it. And so that's another thing. A lot of times when people tell stories, they tell them from their own point of view. That would be the natural thing to do if you're not a trained storyteller or trained marketer. But ultimately, in a way, your stories, if it's going to persuade, needs to be in some way either about your customer or your prospect, or very identifying with that, something that the person can identify with. Because if they can't put themselves into the story, then you've lost a lot of your persuasion power.
How do you know how to speak to them directly? I've heard people use like Quora and like sites like Reddit to figure out like what people are struggling with, and like reading the comments and then like rejigging them to like basically talk back to them. I wasn't doing that at first. Like I didn't have like enough like market research type things that I was doing, but like how does one, like as a professional storyteller, copywriter, like know what to say as the customer if like you're new, I guess, and you don't have social proof and like you don't have that backing?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing is to talk to a few people who might be your prospects. Maybe even do like, I know we're not using Zoom, we're using Riverside, but doing a Zoom call and then transcribing it. I mean, you need to develop your ear to listen to how people talk, especially about this, the kind of people you want, how they talk about your problem. But you can find that on Reddit, on Quora. You can find it on Amazon. Take a good look at the comments there. You're looking for phrases. I mean, you need to learn some basic things about human nature, right? You need to learn people are moving away from pain, and people don't always want to take responsibility for themselves, but there are some people who always take responsibility. You kind of need to get a psychological profile of who your customer is. I don't know what the first steps of that are. I think it's just becoming fascinated with people. One of the things I do sometimes when I'm watching a movie on Netflix, and I watch them alone because I know this would be annoying as hell if someone were sitting with me, is I try to predict the next line before it's spoken. And I've gotten pretty good at it some of the time. I don't watch the whole movie that way, but there's sometimes I say, I know what he's going to say. And yeah, because the person who wrote it, I mean, I've just spent a lot of time learning about how people really react in the real world, just learning to pay attention, listening to how people tell stories. That helps too.
So in the book, you had about like 4 or 5 different people that the book was for. Like that was kind of like your niche, if you will. I was wondering, like, do you look also like also on your Amazon for this book, you have about 80 reviews. So I would assume that that's like a treasure trove for like other products as well. Like you go through those for one and like figure out, like group them and figure out, hey, could I use this to any other thing? Because it seems to be a common problem that I'm seeing in these comments. And like, how did you come up with like, I guess, the niche of the people to go after for this particular book?
Well, it was a matter of my experience. I've worked in over 100 industries over the course of my career. And what are the populous industries these days and who's marketing online? And I might have missed some, but my thought is I can say anybody who sells and could use stories, but people might not realize that's them. So I broke it down a little. I am completing an online course, which goes a little deeper into this. I got some comments and requests for that right away when the book came out. Some of those were on LinkedIn. So I don't know, probably this fall. We have 2 more modules. The last module is going to be a 2-part module. So we got about an hour more to record. And then there's editing, and then there's putting up a website and all that kind of stuff. So a few months from now.
One last question, because that reminded me of the book. Actually, it sounded like early 2000, someone had approached you to teach them how to copyright when you were going to another school. I can't remember if it was for like filmmaking or something, but script writing or something. But you'd gone there essentially, and someone's like, hey, teach me how to copyright, and then you recorded it with like on a tape recorder because it was the early 2000s, and then someone published it, and you made like $6,000, and it was money was tight at the time, so that was like a huge win. So like, could you, I guess, last point, just walk me through that experience? Because it seems like that's like pre to what you're doing now. Even though the course is probably similar, you were probably one of the OGs, though, doing the course in like the early 2000s. So it wasn't so easy to do it now. We really have like all these different tools that make it a lot easier.
Yeah. So I was taking a screenwriting class in Marin County, and the teacher would talk about various psychological insights you could use to write dialogue or move the story forward. And I would raise my hand and say, well, from the tawdry world of copywriting, that reminds me of, and I did that a few times. A couple of the students from the class came up to me and said, David, what is this copywriting you're talking about? Would you teach it to us? And I said, well, if you would allow me to record it and sell it, I will teach it to you. And those days, it wasn't as easy as getting a USB mic or even with you and me with our more advanced equipment, it was much harder. But I got a guy from New Dimensions Radio. That was the network that he recorded for. I got him to come into my apartment. I brought them in. And then I have a friend, Joe Vitale, who knew a guy who was a real internet pioneer named Mark Joyner. And Joe said, I think you ought to send, those days it was cassettes and workbook. It was all physical product and very old school technology. And I sent it to Mark, and I got this email from him. He said, I'm in my car. I only listened to half of your first cassette. I definitely want to publish this. And so we did, and we put it out on the internet, and it just, $6,000 of sales in the first week. It was crazy.
Wow. It's like life changing. Like it's
was
crazy. Like one offer could be life changing. And I think that's kind of like the last thought I want to leave with. It seems like, is that the case for you in your career, that it could be just one thing like that where it changes the way you think about things?
Yes. And I have to tell you, at that point, I was doing a lot more copywriting than I'm doing these days. But my goal was to have a product. The original reason I wanted a product so badly is I analyzed all of the really big names in the industry. And I don't think they were better copywriters than a lot of others, but they had a product out there. That was before everybody had a product. That was before everybody was a content creator. And so I thought, well, I ought to too. So I didn't do it to change my life, but it did change my life because I realized, wow, people need this information, and I'm exceptionally good at explaining things clearly and making it accessible to other people. And a lot of the people in copywriting, they were really well intentioned. They were promoters, they were salespeople, they were marketers, and they weren't as good at it. So I got a certain distinction in my brand that way too. I didn't start coaching for maybe another 15 years. No, actually at that point, another 5 years, I think. But nevertheless, it set the foundation.
Yeah, what was probably possible. But yeah, I really appreciate your time, David. Where do people reach out if they want to, I guess, connect with you or get the course, or where would you like to send people?
Yeah. So, the best place probably is LinkedIn. That's where we met. Also, I'm on Twitter X, I call it. And, my podcast is copywriterspodcast.com. And if someone is serious about coaching, I'll say right now it's expensive. So it's probably not for beginners, but garfinkelcoaching.com. I do coaching. I do copy critiques.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time.
You're welcome. Thank you.